This is Andrew, and I made him keep hold of a celebrity's loo seat for 8 years on the off chance they came on this show.
Which celebrity?
It was Beyoncé. Sorry, not Beyoncé, the other one. Mark Lawrenson.
He's a commentator, isn't he?
He used to play for Liverpool and he was a pundit for Match of the Day about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah. So how did Mark Lawrenson get hold of Andrew's loo seat?
No.
Andrew get hold of Mark Lawrence?
Yeah, good question.
Well, it came free as an extra bonus with the other thing that he bought off Mark Lawrenson.
A house.
Correct.
OK, so Andrew bought Mark Lawrenson's house.
I know.
And...
He said he's doing his renovation. He said, oh, I'm getting rid of this. It just as a jovial thing to say.
He was holding
this is Mark Lawrence's loo seat and get rid of it.
He was holding the loo seat.
He was miming it, I think, at the time.
He was miming it?
He was miming it.
He mimed the loo seat. When he talked to you about his house renovations, he said, I'm getting rid of Mark Lawrenson's loo seat, and he did a little mime.
To be fair, it might be that was my interpretation of what happened at the time.
OK.
Yes.
But then you said, hold on to it, because I might see him and give it back.
No. What were we 8 years ago? Series 10? You know, on this show, if anything happens, you grab it with both hands.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if he comes on this show, I can say, this is Mark Lawrence's loo seat as a possession.
But then he'll come on the show and then you'll just go, oh, this is your loo seat.
And what would he say?
Oh, yeah.
What do you mean, oh, yeah? Are you telling me if I got out a loo seat now, you'd recognise it as yours?
It depends. Is it distinctive in any way?
Nothing at all, apart from the red and the LFC and the this is Mark Lawrence's loo seat. Nothing.
How do you know Andrew?
He's a relative.
OK. Well, can you be more specific?
Yeah, he's my great-grandmother. He is my cousin.
What year was this that he bought Mark Lawrenson's house?
Oh, I'm going to say 10 years ago.
You said 8 before.
No, I didn't. I said he's been hanging on to the loo seat for 8 years. He didn't do the renovation for the first 2 years. Next
But he would have had it for the 2 years.
If this is true, will we get to see the loo seat?
I don't do the admin. The loo seat...
I'm just at it...
Yes. If that's what you want to hear, David, yes.
All right. We need an answer, so, David's team, is Andrew Ivo's painted pal, Kadina's fast friend, or Lee's seat steward?
I think it's Kadina.
It does, on the surface, that feels like the story that has the fewest holes in
I
it.
think so, and I think, yeah.
My toilet seat's got no holes.
It just comes out of sort of...
It comes with a free mop!
Yeah. Shall we go with Kadina?
Kadina.
Kadina?
Yes.
Kadina, yeah.
We'll go with
We're going to
Kadina.
say that it's Kadina and the dog event. Andrew, would you please reveal your true identity?
I'm Andrew, and Lee made me keep hold of the toy.
Yes, Andrew is Lee's seat steward, and what's more...